Hello, everyone. This will be a continuation of our series, Was Paul an Herodian Infiltrator? This will be episode 1.3 because we're looking a little deeper in Operation Messiah, the book that makes out this case. This is going to include an interview by Simca in his series called Naked Archaeologist of Colonel Rose Sheldon on her book, Operation Messiah. And again, you'll see she's an intelligence officer. Let me show you that by background. Colonel Rosemary Sheldon is head of the Department of History at the Virginia Military Institute. She received her PhD in ancient history from the University of Michigan. Her dissertation on robot intelligence gathering won a National Intelligence Book Award. I dare say she's qualified to give her opinions here. She is on the editorial boards for the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, the Journal of Military History, and Small Wars and Insurgencies. And look for her slide where she talks about her spy checklist. I'll leave it for her later exposition to you, but this is going to be the thing she wants us to focus upon in her book in particular, but we're going to let her verbally explain it here to Simca.
What does it all mean?
This is where the archaeology has been found.
Oh, hi, how are you? Look at that.
I need a planter. A shrine to a belly button.
This is a rock of Saul? Look at that. No one gets into this place. No one. Nice. Whoa, don't take me too far. Now that's naked archaeology. No one, besides Jesus himself, has had more influence on the Christian movement than St. Paul the Apostle. There are more New Testament writings credited to him than anyone else. They're called the Pauline epistles, and it's these writings and lessons that have directly shaped modern-day Christianity. But Paul wasn't a disciple of Jesus. He never met Jesus or heard him preach. You won't find him chowing down at the Last Supper. Paul only converted to Christianity after Jesus had been crucified. You could say he was the original born-again Christian. But it turns out that Jesus appointed James, his very own brother, to lead the Jerusalem church after the crucifixion.
I thought I told you to kill that story.
So if James was the appointed leader, how come Paul gets all the credit? Some scholars are now suggesting that Paul was a spy, a Roman agent sent to infiltrate the Jesus movement. We're out to come face to face with the real Paul, the real James, and the real message of Jesus. Military historian Rosemary Sheldon thinks the facts point to Paul the Roman citizen becoming Paul the Roman spy.
Is the story as told in Acts plausible? Visions can be had and conversions can be done, but an historian does not deal in miracles. An historian has to deal in facts. And so we looked at the story and we said, okay, what could the alternative be? A man acting in this manner. What might Paul be doing other than preaching? And that's where the undercover part came. That if you look at the possibility that he was an intelligence officer, it all makes complete sense. And it's much more logical, and no miracles are required to reconcile that kind of story.
Before we go accusing anybody of being a spy, let alone one of the fathers of Christianity, we'll need to know what to look for. I'm off to travel in the footsteps of Paul, and I've asked Rosemary Sheldon to tell us how to spy on a spy.
Watch what he does. You see his actions, not necessarily his words. See who he associates with. Paul is always surrounded by Roman officers, Roman governors, people of wealth. Certainly a spy has to take on many identities, not just a change of a name, but it could be the change of your appearance. You have to be able to move between one milieu and the next. Those are good skills to have if you're in the intelligence business.
You're getting interested, huh? Sure, I'm interested.
I'm going to start my journey by looking into Paul's actions. And what better place to start than where it all began, in his hometown of Tarsus. I'm here with Professor of Religious Studies, Barry Wilson.
So we're walking along an ancient Roman road, one that Paul undoubtedly walked along many times.
There's no other choice, right?
No other choice. This was the road that connected Tarsus and the plain of Sicilia behind us. It takes us in the direction of the Taurus Mountain. And when he comes up to Jerusalem many years later, I mean, he only spends a couple of weeks with the acknowledged head of the followers of Jesus.
Jesus' brother.
Jesus' own brother, James, a person who knew Jesus and knew what he stood for. It's from Paul that we get the Christianity that we have. But he truly was a mystery man.
So when we analyze the texts, we find out that we don't know much about the man. But Paul's sketchy past didn't stop him from becoming Christianity's top guy.
Make yourself so valuable your employer can't let you go.
He had another identity, a bounty hunter, hot on the trail of the Nazarenes. And the showdown between James and Paul was inevitable.
All that work, courage, going after these thugs.
And as archaeologist Robert Eisenman will tell us, that confrontation did happen on the steps of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Not just a showdown.
I don't suppose you'd fight a man without your sword.
A showdown, throwdown. I'm on a search to find the real Saint Paul, the man celebrated as the father of Christianity. And as it turns out, the closer we look at the life of Paul, the more questions we have. Rosemary Sheldon has told us that having many identities is crucial to being a spy, and Paul had plenty.
Who would that be?
Before he was Paul, he was Saul, and he was a bounty hunter persecuting the Jesus movement.
You're a special something or other, aren't you?
Prosecutor.
Until he had his conversion experience and became Saint Paul.
Get down there right away and take care of things.
Yeah, I'll do that.
We're off to the Second Temple steps in Jerusalem. It's here that a showdown is said to have occurred between Paul and James, the leader of the Jesus movement after the crucifixion.
I'm a patriot and a zealot.
A meeting, archaeologist Robert Eisenman.
Robert Eisenman, Revolutionary Theory, take 1.
Robert Eisenman has compared the writings of Pope Clement, called the Pseudo-Clementine writings, and the Clementine version, and Clement, by the way, was there witnessing these events. A Paul-like figure actually assaults someone, James, the brother of Jesus.
Basically, you're decoding the text.
Decoding multiple texts, putting them together side by side and trying to find out what actually underpins them all.
If we go to these other texts that were kind of delegitimized by the official church, we get the inside story of what Paul really did on these steps.
Who Paul was, what he did, who James was, how important he was, the real story.
Simca never goes into depth with Eisenman about what he's talking about, so I'm just going to give you a little more depth before I let the presentation continue. So he's talking about Saul. Paul is the person who is regarded as having attacked James. This is recorded in the book of Recognitions and the homilies as well, and he's going to be looking at mostly the recognitions. And Eisenman speaks about this in his very first book on the topic of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Ebion, which was called James, the Brother of Jesus, the Key to Unlocking the Secrets of Early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls, page 584 to page 589. Just going to give you a quick overview, but I'm going to add this as another section or subsection to this part in a subsequent video, probably the very next one, because it's going to take too long to present all of it here. But he talks about the Recognitions was written in the in the 40 AD period, approximately. The period is being covered there. And he says it's very important that you can link Christianity to the Dead Sea Scrolls by looking at this material. He's going to talk about the fact that James is the Bishop of Jerusalem. And actually what it is that Peter is reporting into James. And so that's very interesting. He writes a letter and so does Clement. And so that's what's in these Clementine recognitions. There are letters to James. And then it leads up to what he's getting into with Simca, which there's an attack by someone who obviously is Paul in context. In the Recognitions, this page 587, Peter, who is in the midst of his own debates, tells Clement the story of the debates on the temple steps between James and the high priests or temple establishment. Ending the riot led ending in the riot led by Paul that resulted in James being injured and left for dead. The fact of such interesting material delivered in such precise detail is not easily gainsaid, and we'll see why. Eisenman continues, as Peter tells it to Clement, the high priest sent priests to ask the leaders of the assembly in Jerusalem, led by James, if they would enter into the debates on the temple steps with the Orthodox priesthood. They accept, and preliminary debates between the apostles on the one hand and Caiaphas and the other high priests on the other ensue. In the midst of this, James, the bishop of bishops in Recognitions 1:68, went up to the temple with the whole church 1:66. Eisenman pauses to observe about the level of detail he's reading and why it gives him confidence it's the original actual events being recorded. He says some of the historical detail is compelling. In fact, in the author's view, we have a truer picture of these clashes in the temple and what really went on in the early church in Jerusalem than in Acts. He says, for instance, when James the bishop went up to the temple in this episode, there was a great multitude who had been waiting since the middle of the night to see him. This kind of non-fantastic detail is startling. Therefore, standing on an elevation so that he might be seen by all the people, this can be nothing other than the picture of James standing on the pinnacle of the temple in early church accounts. So there are multiple accounts of that in Eusebius and Jerome. James takes his stand as the other apostles had done on the steps of the temple. From here, James begins his discourse, which supposedly continues for 7 days. One immediately recognizes that one is in the same milieu of that reflected via Hegesippus. He's a writer from the 200s, and who's quoted by Eusebius, of James being placed by the scribes and Pharisees on the pinnacle of the temple. So this is also recorded in Jerome, Eusebius, and then in turn Hegesippus in smaller snippets, so that he could be seen by all the people. However, the physical setting, at least of the pseudo-Clementines, is more convincing. Okay, now back to the story. At the point, this says Eisenman's synopsis, at the point when James is about to win over all the people, including the priests, meaning the lower ordered priests, I believe, compare this with the notice in Acts about a large group of priests making their conversion. That's in Acts 6, verse 7. So lower order priests are not Herodian necessarily. The Herodian appointee is only the high priest, and he would be more loyal to Herod. Then it says, Heisman summarizes, an enemy entered the temple with a few other men and started arguing with James. That's in 1:70. A marginal note, I'm put asterisk here, is important. In one manuscript states that this enemy was Saul. Saulus, keep that in mind, not Paul, Saulus. You'll see why that's important. This is confirmed in the next section because after getting letters, as in Acts, from the chief priests, the enemy pursues the community, which is fled to Jericho all the way to Damascus. So this whole event with James being thrown down by Saulus to the floor from the pinnacle, that led to the church fleeing to Damascus. Now maybe you could put together what's going on 3 years after the crucifixion of Christ. You have this whole event where Paul claims he's pursuing people into Damascus, and on whose behalf? On the high priest's behalf, not the lower priest's behalf, because the high priest is a Herodian, and he would commission him and give him authority. Go get them, stop them. So this is the consequence of this riot that Saulus, according to the marginal note, engaged in this action. But we'll see. There's other evidence that links Paul and Saul to this. Saul to this. By his loud shouts, by this person, this rioter guy, Shaul or Paul, probably, right? That's what the marginal note says. By his loud shouts, abuse, and vilification, this enemy raised such a clamor in the temple that people could no longer hear what James was saying. This enemy, Saul, behaved like one insane, and this is a quote from the Recognitions, exciting everyone to murder and setting an example himself, seized a strong stick from the altar, at which point there ensued a riot of beating and beaten on either side. Okay. And then on page 588, it says, one should note the intimate and precise detail here, often a sign of authenticity. According to the Recognitions, much blood was shed, followed by a confused flight, in the midst of which the enemy attacked James and threw him headlong from the top of the steps. Again, one should note the detail. This, of course, is James' headlong fall from the temple pinnacle that's also mentioned in Jerome. So this is not something made up, but that was not well known in church history. It's just the background explanation provided by the Ebionites. It's an Ebionite document. The version we have before us here is from Rufinus's Latin version. There is no Greek version. I'm going to pause there. So Rufinus, it's a well-known fact, he translated the Clementine recognitions and the homilies, and then obviously he destroyed all the Greek copies. Fortunately, the Syriac survives and has differences and things that were left out. But Rufinus did make a pretty good statement in certain categories. You can just see it has all that detail that would be of a true account, and he hasn't romanticized it or made it look bad. And he changes when he can. When it's really Paul, he'll change it to Simon Magus' name and things like that. It's easily transparent with some of the things he does. But anyway, I digress. Let's keep reading. The version we have before us here of the Clementine recognitions is from Rufinus's Latin version. There is no Greek version, which is not surprising, but there is a Syriac version, again, not surprisingly. In it, this passage reads as follows. A certain man who was an enemy with a few others came into the temple near the altar. He cried out, saying, "What are you doing, O children of Israel? Are you so easily carried away by these miserable men who stray after a magician?" This, of course, is reference to Jesus. I'm just going to pause there. Eisenman doesn't mention this, but this is exactly the rhetoric that Paul uses. Who are you? Galatians. Oh, you foolish Galatians. Who has led you astray? It's the same voice, same echo. You can hear the same person. Argumentation then followed, and just at that point, when he was about to, quote, be overcome in debate by James the bishop, he began to create this person, probably Saul, when he was known as Saul. He began to create a great commotion so that matters that were being correctly and calmly explained could not be either properly examined nor understood and believed. At that point, he raised an outcry over the weakness and the foolishness of the priests, reproaching them and crying out, "Why do you delay? Why do you not immediately seize all those who are with him?" Then he rose and was first to seize a firebrand from the altar, that is, the piece of wood. Let me go on here and find where the bracket ends, and began beating people with it. The rest of the priests, when they saw him, then followed his example. In the panic-stricken flight that ensued, some fell over others, and others were beaten. Here, then, is the parallel to the young man of the bolder sort, allied to the high priest, beating the poor priests on the threshing floors that immediately precedes Josephus's introduction of the Herodian he is calling Solus, and the picture in Book 20 of the Antiquities of the Jews of the various brawls on the Temple Mount between the Zealots and the high priests. Again, this is paralleled in early church accounts, which always include the point of James being beaten, reflected too in the parallel gospel instances on the beating of James. So what he's referring to is there's a character, Saulus, who does the very same things where he's trying to protect the interests of the high priest against the lower priest, and he starts beating up the high priest. And it says explicitly he is a member of the family of Herod Antipas, and he is definitely serving their interest, the Herodian interest, to defeat the lower order priests, which benefits their appointee, which is the high priest, who doesn't want to give extra pay to the lower priest. And this discussion about these works of Josephus mentioning Saulus, and obviously meaning Paul, when he changed his name later in the book of Acts, or the name he was using from Saul to Paul in Acts 16. This is all in our episode 18 on famous quotes about Paul regarding none other than Josephus. And this is the work we were looking at, the Antiquities chapter 20, the War of the Jews chapter 2, book 17, or not book 17, chapter 17. And we have all the quotes there on the screen. We have that for Antiquities, and we have it for War of the Jews. So if you want, you can go there right away, and you can look that up if you want to find reference to it. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Sheldon and this idea of an infiltrator. But I thought it would be very important that you can see that Paul was a very bold, violent person in attacking Christianity, and if you can't beat him, because he'd have to keep beating them all up. He beat up James, and that didn't work. So if you can't beat him, you got to join him. So let's resume with Simca's account of Eisenman's relaying this incident to try to give us all an idea of how close Paul was to the people of power, the Herodians, serving their mission before his road to Damascus event. All right, so we'll now return to Simca.
The Second Temple was the center of Jewish worship at the time of James and Paul. It's where the action happened. Thousands would assemble. Roman sentries watched the masses closely, always on the lookout for a riot.
Clement comes to Palestine just at the time that the authorities have invited the early Christian leaders to come onto these temple steps and quiet this mass of people down here who the document admits were hungering after the Messiah. So each of the apostles, just like Acts, is pictured as giving his speech in turn until finally my Lord James speaks last. And the narrative said he's just about to win the crowd over to how he is seeing the Messianic movement when an angry, riotous enemy, a hostile man, the man who was our enemy, emerges and yells at the crowd, "Why are we being misled by these people? Come, attack them."
According to Eisenman, that hostile man was Paul. It was him that ordered the crowd to attack James.
It's embarrassing because here's Paul stoning the brother
No,
of
not stoning. Physically attacking him. That's what these stairs are about. Throwing him down these stairs.
I wouldn't want to be thrown down the stairs. You're saying this, what Paul did is he grabbed James physically and he threw him down stairs like this. I'm just thinking of what it would feel like to be thrown down these steps. I don't think it would feel very good.
James is said to have escaped the riot with the help of the apostles, but suffered 2 broken legs from the attack. For Saul the persecutor, another identity change was needed. The Messianic movement was still growing, and for Paul it was time to switch to plan B. If you can't beat him, join him.
Here's to the first angel I ever met.
We're traveling in the footsteps of St. Paul the Apostle, the man known as the father of Christianity. But some scholars think that Paul might have had another agenda.
It's hard to tell what you mean.
That Paul was an undercover agent for the Romans. So far, we've learned that Paul was a persecutor of the early Christians, now led by Jesus' brother, James.
Judea was a nation once. Someday she will be again.
But for Saul the bounty hunter, a public persecutor is too well known, and he needed a new cover story.
You need help? See the angel. Who's this angel?
And in military historian Rosemary Sheldon's view, Paul's miraculous conversion is the most convincing evidence of all that he was a Roman spy.
Why do you suspect that maybe it's not authentic?
Well, you have to imagine he's working with police from Jerusalem. They're a pretty hard-nosed bunch of people. And they're with him on the road. We don't know what they heard, whether he was the only one that heard it. But suddenly, poof, he becomes a Christian. And think of it in modern terms. If this were a bunch of FBI guys working for J. Edgar Hoover, and suddenly one of them turns and says, I had a dream, Karl Marx came to me, and I've seen the light, and I've now gone over to the other side. They'd either kill him on the spot, or send him to a mental hospital, or lock him up.
According to many scholars, Paul's message seems to have nothing in common with the message that Jesus' followers had been hearing until now. Paul's message, which he said was given to him by Jesus,
A very important guy. Calls himself the angel.
seems to completely contradict what the Jesus of history taught and said. He emphasized circumcision, respecting the Sabbath, keeping Passover, and maintaining a kosher diet. But Paul heard a very different message.
I'm a reformed man.
In his version, you didn't have to circumcise, you didn't have to follow a kosher diet, and he canceled all the Jewish holidays. Why was Paul so off message?
You know, even angels can get their wings clipped.
You got the scissors?
And there's the big one. Jesus said, I come not to bring peace on earth, but the sword. But Paul never hung out with revolutionaries. More than this, Paul seemed to be very comfortable with the Romans. James and his gang weren't buying Paul's approach.
Thanks, friend. Friend to a Roman?
And since Jerusalem was James's turf, Paul took his brand new message and hit the road. The first stop on his salvation tour was Ephesus, an ancient Greek city in what is today Turkey. And it's here that Paul was able to interact with all the cultures of the ancient world. We are here with Professor Barry Wilson.
Ephesus was the Istanbul of the time. It was where East met West. But in Paul's time, this was a major port city. It was a cosmopolitan city. People came from all over the empire here, and it was on a major trade route.
You make a change at Ephesus, and there'll be a ripple effect around the world.
This was a strategic location for Paul and his message.
Paul's MO was always the same. He targeted pagans who were attracted to the religion of the Jews. They were called God-fearers, and they had their own sections in synagogues, so Paul could move through many worlds like a spy. In fact, no one was better at it in his day than Paul. Maybe at Ephesus he delivered his famous lines.
To the Jews, I pretend to be a Jew. To those who observe the Jewish law, I pretend to be observant. To those who are not observant, I say, I'm not observant. To the weak, I pretend to be weak. I have become all things to all men.
A man of many faces, indeed. Next, I'm on my way to the place where Paul was imprisoned by the Romans. Or was he?
Give me time to run this down.
He's a tall man. He's a tall man.
Place looks like the last act of Hamlet. It's the last act for all kinds of things.
We're traveling in the footsteps of St. Paul the Apostle, the man credited with spreading Christianity around the world.
Has anybody invited you to join the Crusaders?
We're continuing our journey to Caesarea on the Israeli Mediterranean coast. Caesarea was the city in the book of Acts where Paul was tried and imprisoned. But to Rosemary Sheldon, the story just doesn't add up.
This is a rare opportunity we have to be sitting on the actual spot where Paul was arrested and supposedly tried before the Roman governor. This is the Roman governor's palace, and Paul would have walked through the entrance and sat before the governor Felix. What the charge is, we're not exactly sure. He caused a riot in Jerusalem, but why the Roman governor would care about some Jews arguing in Jerusalem is obscure.
If I was making a painting of Paul in front of Felix, I would have him in chains. Is that what happens?
Acts tells us that the guards were told to give him a very loose leash, not to make sure he had access to where he wanted to go. He never suffered physically in any way. He seems to live in the governor's palace.
It brings to mind how they treated Jesus. I mean, overnight they crucify him, and Paul seems to get a very different treatment.
That's right. We know that Jesus was followed. We're told that there are men being sent by the government to see what he's doing. What does he do publicly? He starts a riot at the temple. He is surrounded by men that are known revolutionaries. Paul doesn't cause any public disturbance, doesn't preach against the Roman state, makes no public statement that could be in any way considered seditious. He's not surrounded by revolutionary types. It seems that the Romans want him for the information he has. I think it's because he has been investigating the revolutionaries, and so they can debrief him.
So he's not an enemy in custody. He's an agent brought home.
He's an agent brought home in protective custody, and even when he's brought to Rome, he remains an intelligence asset because he's an eyewitness to what is happening in Judea. He can testify to the groups that he infiltrated. He can identify people to the Roman authorities, and it's going to be not too many years after he arrives that there's going to be a full-scale war in Judea, and so an intelligence asset with that kind of first-hand information would be very valuable to the Romans.
So Paul has hit every point on our spy checklist. His associates, his aliases, his actions. On our next program, we're gonna travel even further and dig even deeper to see how scrolls found in a cave in 1945 reveal further evidence that Paul and James were worlds apart.
Okay, so I think we can see the temperament of this woman is very unbiased, in my opinion. She's just telling you from her experience of intelligence operations, how they operate, what you would look for, the signs, the checklist was called by Simca. And she's basically telling us about the earliest plot to destroy the church from within in her book, because in the book it says, in the first example I found, page 58, was that the message of Paul in Galatians 3:13 that Jesus was hung on a tree, and he was cursed, and specifically citing Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 to 23 were fulfilled in Christ, which means Jesus is condemned to hell forever. That's not an atonement process. That's a way of sending somebody off to hell. And supposedly Paul thinks somebody being found accursed can remove a curse from other people. And so Paul said, we're all cursed if we have to obey God's law, because God's law can't be perfectly kept. And he said, the curse of the law is that if you fail to keep one commandment, you're cursed. Well, that's not what it said in Deuteronomy 27, verse 26. It says simply, if you don't uphold that this law should be followed, you will be cursed. That means anybody who's an apostate who says, don't follow this law, it's given by angels, or things to the effect that would negate the duty to obey that law as a whole, that person's cursed, not the person who can't keep every law completely. And so Paul had that wrong. And then he used that doctrine to say, well, now we have to remove the curse of the law. So how do we remove the law applying to this anymore? Jesus became our curse for us because he was hung from a tree, but it was never hung from a tree. It was not a tree. There's no branches and limbs and things of that sort. That's what Deuteronomy 21, verse 22 to 23 was talking about. Paul misapplied it. And she, in this book, pointed that out at page 58. That's the first point we found as we went back reviewing it in our prior episode. So she's very on target, and she knows exactly how you would destroy a group from within. You would give it a poison pill to give to the intended victim, and the victims would be the Jews. The Jews would turn away from a new Messiah meaning a king. The kings were all anointed, and the word anointed in Hebrew was Messiah or Messiah. So that meant Paul was the perfect vehicle to infiltrate, turn the group away from God's law, which is definitely Romans didn't like anybody following their law. As I mentioned in the prior episode, Pontius Pilate specifically wanted to get rid of the law that was mentioned in Josephus. And Paul was perfectly the agent provocateur to get these things done, to negate this group, give them Romans 13 that says you have to obey every word from the officials from above you, as if because they are the agents of God when they speak. But the law of Torah is given by angels who are weak and beggarly elements and want to be bound to them. That's Galatians 3. So Paul clearly denigrates the law given Moses as something not to be followed, but the law of the Herodians, that has to be followed to the letter. And if you don't follow it, Paul says in Romans 13, you're damned. Damnation, condemnation, krima comes upon you. So that's unequivocal end of your salvation by doing anything contrary to what Herod would tell you, the Herod Tetrarch or any of the other Herod kings in the different provinces of Judea at that time. So anyway, I think you have a good understanding now where she's coming from, and we'll continue with reviewing her book, the key points that I'd found in a prior read, and we'll pick that up in the next episode. So look for part 2, which will have this cover page, and we'll pick up at page 65 in our review we were making last time, and part 1, and then we'll see you back then. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.